Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai, Jai Niti Lila Pravishna, Om Vishnupada, Vaishnava Sarvabhaum, Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaja ki jai, Shri Gauriya Vaishnav Guru Varga ki jai. प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्री वसति गौर भक्त वृंद की जय, गंगा माई की जय, जमुना माई की जय, भक्ति देवी की जय, तुलसी देवी की जय, अनंत कोटि वैष्णव वृंद की जय, निताय गौर प्रेमानंदे हरि हरि वो. All glory assemble the devotees, Hare Krishna. All glory assemble the devotees, Hare Krishna. All glory assemble the devotees, Hare Krishna. All glory Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. All glory Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Vishnaya Bhutale Srimate Radha Govinda Goswamiti Namine Namaste Prabhupada Devam Gauravani Pracharine Vishwaswasanya Vatikarya Chanishtarine. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 16, Text 9. Yesham bibharmyaham akhanda vikuntha yoga. Maya vibhutiramalanghri raja kiritaihi. Vipranstu ko na vishaheta yad arhanambaha. Sadya punati saha chandra lalama lokan. Yesham bibharmyaham akhanda vikuntha yoga. Maya vibhutiramalanghri rajah kiritahi. Vipramstu ko na vishaheta yad arhanambaha. Sadya punati saha chandra lalama lokan. Yesham bibharmya aham akhanda vikuntha yoga. Maya vibhutiramalanghri raja kiritahi. Vipramstu ko na vishaheta yad arhanambaha. Sadya punati saha chandra lalama lokan. Yesham bibharmyaham akhanda vikuntha yoga. Maya vibhutiramalanghri raja kiritahi. Vipramstu ko na vishaheta yadarhanambhaha. Sadya punati saha chandra lalama lokan. Yesham bibharmyaham akhanda vikuntha yoga. Maya vibhutiramalanghri raja kiritahi. Vipramstu ko na vishaheta yad arhanambaha. Sadya punati saha chandra lalama lokan. Yesham bibharmyaham akhanda vaikuntha yoga. Maya vibhuti ramalangri raja kiritai. Tam stuko na vishaheta yadarhanambaha. Sadhya punati saha chandra lalama lokan. Yesham bibharmya aham akhanda vikuntha yoga. Maya vibhuti ramalangira raja kirti. Vipram stuko na vishaheta yadarhanambha. Sadhya punati saha chandra lalama lokan. Yesham bibharmyaham akhanda vikuntha yoga. Maya vibhuti ramalangri raja kiritahi. Vipram stuko na vishaheta yadarhanambha. Sadhya punati saha chandra lalama lokan. Yesham, of the Brahmanas. Bibharmi, I bear. Aham, I. Akhanda, unbroken. Vikuntha, unobstructed. Yoga Maya, internal energy. Vibhutihi, opulence. Amala, pure. Angri, off the feet. Rajaha, the dust. Kiritaihi, on my helmet. Vipran, the Brahmanas. Tu, then. Kaha, who. Na, not. Vishaheta, carry. Yat, of the Supreme Lord. Arhana Ambha, water which has washed the feet. Sadhyaha, at once. Punati, sanctifies. Saha, along with. Chandra Lalama, Lord Shiva. Lokan, the three worlds. Translation. I am the master of my unobstructed internal energy, and the water of the Ganges is the remnant left after my feet are washed. That water sanctifies the three worlds, along with Lord Shiva, who bears it on his head. If I can take the dust of the feet of the Vaishnava on my head, who will refuse to do the same? Purport. The difference between the internal and external energies of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is that in the internal energy, or in the spiritual world, all the opulences are undisturbed, whereas in the external or material energy, all the opulences are temporary manifestations. The Lord's supremacy is equal in both the spiritual and material worlds, but the spiritual world is called the kingdom of God, and the material world is called the kingdom of Maya. Maya refers to that which is not actually fact. The opulence of the material world is a reflection. It is stated in Bhagavad Gita that this material world is just like a tree whose roots are up and branches down. This means that the material world is the shadow of the spiritual world. Real opulence is in the spiritual world. In the spiritual world, the predominating deity is the Lord himself, whereas in the material world, there are many lords. That is the difference between the internal and external energies. The Lord says that although He is the predominating factor of the internal energy, and although the material world is sanctified just by the water that has washed his feet, he has the greatest respect for the Brahmana and the Vaishnava. When the Lord himself offers so much respect to the Vaishnava and the Brahmana, how can one deny such respect to such personalities? And again, the translation. I am the master of my unobstructed internal energy, and the water of the Ganges is the remnant left after my feet are washed. That water sanctifies the three worlds, along with Lord Shiva, who bears it on his head. If I can take the dust of the feet of the Vaishnava on my head, who will refuse to do the same? Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadama Hyam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gora Tishe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So, we are continuing along in this wonderful section of Srimad Bhagavatam. I'm thinking every day, actually. Of course, every text of the Srimad Bhagavatam is very worshipful and very beautiful, but especially this section, I feel like all of every day, the texts, they just flow very nicely. And so we're hearing now the wonderful glorification that the Lord is giving of His devotees. And we're hearing this in context of the flowing of the river Ganga, which is of course a very sacred river. And Srila Prabhupada, he pulls out this contrast in terms of comparing the material and spiritual worlds, which of course has the material world and the spiritual world as complete opposites. This material world, as we know, is called the kingdom of Maya, and it is called so because it is not actually fact. In fact, it is the inversion of the spiritual world. That's why there's a general principle that said that which is highest in the spiritual world is lowest in the material world. And so we find Srila Prabhupada, he writes, I think in the second canto, that the most powerful force in this material world is that force of attraction between a male and a female, right? This is such a powerful force that nobody can separate it, at least nobody in the material world, which is why Krishna consciousness is the only remedy for that issue that it causes, right? Which is a constant binding to the material world. Only Krishna is powerful enough to obstruct this attraction. And yet, that is lust, that is karma. But we know the opposite of lust, the inversion of lust, right, is prema, or love. And that is the highest principle in the spiritual world. So we see that which is the lowest thing in this material world is the highest thing in the spiritual world. And because of that, we find very many almost counterintuitive principles in spiritual life, right? In this world, in order to be anything really, one has to prop themselves up, right? It's a very awkward experience that I think most of us can relate with when you're applying for jobs and you're writing a resume. Everyone feels a little bit awkward because it's not a very natural principle actually to be speaking about your own glories, right? You're writing about, this is my glory, this is my other glory, you know? Please take the dust from my lotus feet, right? This is what the resume application process is like. It's very uncomfortable, right? And yet, this is how we must go. We must be always proclaiming our glories, right? Recently, we have a new Prime Minister, and lots of people are very happy I'm also very happy, because then I could stop hearing about politics for another 3 years. So there's a lot of happiness, and it's very interesting. You always see them come up and they go onto the stage and they say, under my government, there'll be no more of the threefold sufferings, right? This world will be cleansed of any misfortune. And it's always proclaiming our own glories like this. And yet, what do we find in spiritual life? We find the complete opposite, right? Spiritual life. Trinadapi sunichena, taroreva sahishnana, manina, manadena, kirtaniya sadaharihi, right? This is the principle that we hear. What qualification do we need to chant the holy name? There's many things people will think, right? Maybe I need to wear Radha Kuntilak, right? Maybe I need to have fancy silk dhotis, right? Maybe, if I have the shiniest kurta, right? Handmade, tailor-made especially for me, then I will be qualified to be a great kirtaniya, right? Maybe we'll think like this. But who do we see? Who is Namacharya? Srila Haridas Thakur, right? And what is Haridas Thakur's qualification? Haridas Thakur's qualification is that whichever temple he wished to go into, they wouldn't accept him. Wherever he went, Muslims would hate him and they would beat him. And Hindus would be much the same, right? Mistreated, completely rejected. This is Haridas Thakur's qualification, right? Because he is embodying this attitude. What does he do with all of this mistreatment? Does he stamp his foot down and say, I'm such a great acharya, I'm such a great devotee, why are you doing this? No, Thakur Haridas, he simply accepts it. And this is what makes him qualified to be Namacharya, right? So again, this is how qualification works. It's very, very counterintuitive. And yet again, it's counterintuitive in a way that makes sense. I was in Port Macquarie, and whenever I go to Port Macquarie, I like to drive, because I don't like to drive in Sydney. I don't think anyone does, right? But I'll drive when I go back so I don't lose the skill of driving, because while I'm here, I'm not going to be doing it. And so I'll go on long drives, and I was driving up, there's a mountain, I don't know if it's a mountain, a hill, something or another. It's called Komboin. It's the middle of nowhere. It's complete peak rural Australia, right? Which is why it's fun to drive in. You'll only see yourself for like a few hours. And as I was driving, at one point you go away from, civilization, and the roads become really, really, really bad, right? And there's cracks in them, and if you're lucky, the road is made of tar. Otherwise, it's just rocks and things like that. But what I was thinking was, you can see where there's a road, all of the plant life is killed, right? On the sides of the road, you'll see big, large trees, all of these majestic plants, right? All plant life is dead as you drive along, because of course, it's not much point of a road if it's covered in trees, right? But what I did notice is that even though all of these other plants are gone, you'll still see blades of grass, right? You'll still see them growing in the road, right? And I was thinking, this is the glory actually, right? Because Trinadapi sunichena, this is the glory of the blade of grass, right? Because it's so humble and it can take all the beatings of all of these cars driving on it, it's surviving, right? All of these other trees, they're getting cut down, they're getting destroyed. But the humble little blade of grass, right? Getting completely and continuously beaten down. This is the one that is surviving, right? And so this is the one that's actually having the most thriving life out of all the plant life there. So we find this principle, right? Jesus Christ has a very famous saying, those who are first shall come last, and those who are last shall come first. And this is a very, very important spiritual principle. So like this we find, upside down, inside out, spiritual life inverts everything. And so it is very mysterious, and it is very powerful, and it acts itself as a means to verify itself, right? We can always think of all of the great miracles. Sometimes they'll say, when they hear the pastimes of Krishna, right? People will say, oh, how can I believe this, right? Animals are talking, right? This little blue boy, he's defeating all these demons, right? All of these spectacular events are happening. We hear about when Putana dies, how many miles of trees are completely flattened. My spiritual master says they weren't just flattened, they were eviscerated, right? They became like dust. How can we believe such tall and big descriptions, right? People say, oh, this is very fantastical. Actually, Srila Prabhupada was once told this. He met one individual who had read Krishna book, right? And having read Krishna book, Srila Prabhupada asked him, so, what did you think? What did you think of this literature? And the person said, it was very nice. It was a little bit fantastical. Srila Prabhupada, he said, you are fantastical for thinking that the Supreme Lord cannot do these things, right? So we can hear these things and we can think they're a little fantastical. But actually, the most fantastical aspect of all of the Vedic literature is to think that anyone can so sincerely hold to this devotion, right? The most fantastical part of the Vedic literature isn't any of these other things. We hear in the 9th canto, of course, we know lots of devotees, they love Ram Katha. Actually, we all love Ram Katha, right? Ramchandra's pastimes are so wonderful. And yet, going through Srimad Bhagavatam, sometimes devotees are waiting and waiting, and then they finally reach the 9th canto, and they think, wow, finally, I'll hear the pastimes of Lord Ramchandra. I'm going to hear chapters and chapters of all of his glories. And then we hear 2 chapters, right? And they're sort of, in one sense, sometimes some devotees, they get, I don't want to say disappointed, but they were hoping for more. But actually, those 2 chapters, they're so nectarian. It has that whole essence in there, right? You don't really need much more. But there's a wonderful shloka in there. And it speaks about all the pastimes of Ramchandra, right? It speaks about all of them. But then what it says is it talks, the famous ones. If you stop anyone on the street, maybe any Indian-bodied individual at least on the street, right? And you ask them, good luck at universities, going up to a random Australian person, asking them what their favorite parts of Ram's pastimes are. But if you stop at least the average Indian-bodied person, right, a pious Hindu, right, and ask them, they'll say, oh wow, there's the building of the bridge to Lanka, right? All of these things they'll say. And so these things are listed in the 9th canto. But what is said, in Srimad Bhagavatam, it's said that these are not the glories of Lord Ramchandra. And yet we would think these are the glories of Lord Ramchandra, right? These are the things which he is known for. Instead, it is given that the glories of Lord Ramchandra are his devotees, right? Srila Prabhupada, he writes this reciprocal mood of Lord Ramchandra with his devotees. This is the true glory of Lord Ramchandra. And again, this is the true glory of all of spiritual life. We can hear of these miraculous details and they are wonderful, but they are wonderful only insofar as they are a reciprocation of the Lord and his devotee. His Holiness Bhakti Vikash Maharaj, I was listening, he was giving Radha Ashtami class, and it was very esoteric. I tapped out halfway. I thought it was a bit elevated. But he was making this really wonderful philosophical point. And he was speaking about how without Shakti, what is anything? It is empty. It cannot move, it cannot do anything. You need some sort of agitation in the philosophical sense for things to move, right? And yet we see Krishna, he is moving a lot, right? Krishna is dancing and he's running and he's doing all of these things. And in fact, this material world itself is filled with motion, right? We're seeing that the stars are moving, or maybe they're not moving, depends how you want to read 5th canto. But at least the planets are moving. We can find a non-controversial point there, right? The planets are moving, right? There's some sort of motion in this world, right? All of this is happening. And yet, why is it happening, right? Because the Supreme Lord, right, Sri Bhagavan Krishna, what is he full of? He's full of all of these 6 opulences. And if you're full of all of them, if you're full of wealth, right, if you're full of all of these other things, knowledge, power, what else do you need, right? Especially if you're full of renunciation. The whole idea is you won't want anything more, right? Yet why does he move, right? Why would a Supreme Lord who is infinitely full do anything at all, right? Why do we do things? We do things because we want something, because we need something, right? There's no other explanation for why people get up in the morning and go to work, right? Because they want something, right? 9 out of 10 times they want money, right? And they want money, why? Because they want something else. They want to pay for their... I need to think, all my cultural references are really out of tap. Actually, all my Bhakti Shastri students, they laugh at me because I'll always say, these materialists, they'll go home and they'll watch The Simpsons. They'll say, Prabhu, nobody watches The Simpsons anymore. So whatever, it used to be Netflix, but apparently now it's all these, I don't know, who knows, the glories of Maya Devi. That's all I can say. So what are they doing? They're getting this money and they're going in order to do all of these different things, right? But why would the Supreme Lord move, right? And so Bhakti Vikash Maharaj, he was saying, this is the glory of Srimati Radharani, and this is the glory of actually the internal potency, right? Because this is spurring that Supreme Lord who is completely full to have some motion within himself, right? That Supreme Lord who is completely satisfied by the manifestation of his internal potency, of his devotees, right? That is causing the Lord to move, right? Because now suddenly Krishna, right? He is thinking, oh, I want to run with my friends, right? Now suddenly there is an abhed, right? Because achintya abhed, right? There is this separation. There's this room for movement. And because of this movement now, suddenly Krishna, he is running for his devotees, right? And suddenly now there is movement. There's that disturbance. We hear in the Upanishads there's a description, which isn't a chronological one. Sometimes devotees think of it as chronological, where it said that the Supreme Lord was alone, and therefore he expanded out all of his associates. Sometimes we can think in a Western sense, right, where there's this beginning, middle, and an end, right? And so people will think sometimes this is a beginning. But rather it's a description of the nature of things, right? It's not describing an event that ever happened, because there's never been a point where the Lord was alone, right? But rather it's trying to illustrate this very same principle, right? Because the Lord has these, therefore there is movement. And because there is movement, therefore all of these other things happen, right? All of the planets are moving, all of the material worlds are manifesting, all these pastimes are happening because the Lord has his internal energy to reciprocate with, right? And then of course there's also the marginal energy who he reciprocates with, but when they're filled with Bhakti Devi, who is an aspect of the internal energy, right? So like this, the Lord is brought to movement, right? So we find this, right? This is the nature of the material world. And this is the nature of the spiritual world. And they're two very different things. And so we find this Lord, what is he acting out of? He's not acting out of an emptiness in the same way that all motion, all movement, all action in this world is, right? Karma, right? Karma in this world is done purely, right, out of a need for something. And yet we have the Supreme Lord who is acting out of Leela, right? Leela is acting out of a fullness, right? Krishna is full of love for his devotees, and therefore he acts. And Krishna's devotees are full of love for Krishna, and therefore they act, right? Very similar, it seems, right? The movement, activity, right? There's a famous example. N.K. Sanyal, I think his name was, a revered disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. If you read the Harmonist magazine that was published under Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada's time, he would often be writing articles, right? And so he brought his brother once, who was a non-devotee, to the mutt that he was in, right? And his brother came with him, and he stayed, and he, had a nice time, and afterwards he was leaving, and he said, I had a good time, but I don't see why you think I should join, right? I eat, you guys are eating. I sing songs, you guys are singing songs. I hear nice little stories, you guys hear nice little stories too. What's the difference? And so his brother, he told him, the devotee, he said, eating? When did we eat? And his brother, he said, what are you talking about? I had those rice, dal, rotis. I had all of this wonderful feast. I enjoyed it so much. And he said, oh, you were eating. We were honoring prasad, right? That was the principle he was making. Sometimes externally it can seem similar, but they're very, very different, right? Karma and Leela. Therefore we see. That's why it's offensive, right? Sometimes we'll hear, to think of the pure devotees, right? To think of them undergoing some sort of karma, or to think of them as engaging in regular material activities, because they are very much on that same platform, right? They are engaging in Leela as well. That's why we have it. Janma karma cha me divyam evam yoveti tatvata tyaktva deham punarjanma naiti mam eti sorjana, right? We hear this principle. When one understands the birth and, karma of the Lord in truth, right? Then one is freed from the pangs of this material nature, because one then enters into that reality, right? That reality of Leela, right? A reality of fullness. And so, therefore, we hear the glories of the devotees, which the Supreme Lord here is saying that he is completely willing to even take the dust off their lotus feet onto their head, right? The glories of the devotees are a topic that we hear of often, but not often enough. If we were to hear about the glories of the devotees constantly, it would still not be enough, right? Because it's said, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he published a magazine, a daily magazine, publishing Harikatha about Mahaprabhu, right? And so one person told him, he said, all these mundane magazines, their newspapers, they're running once a week, twice a week. How do you think you can run one daily? Saraswati Thakur, he was saying the same point we hear here in the purport, right? What is happening in this material world? Same thing day in, day out, right? And the same sort of nonsense. And yet the Supreme Lord, he is infinitely so beautiful. How many infinite pastimes are coming out from him? If you can do so often as once a week on mundane topics, then easily we can do once a day, right? On spiritual topics. So, if that is true about the Supreme Lord, then how much more true is it about his devotees, who that same Supreme Lord takes the dust of their feet and places it on their heads? I remember once when I was with Nrsinga Kavacha Prabhu in my apartment, I was in my attempts at false humility. I told him, I said, Prabhu, I can't remember exactly what I said. It was something along the lines, among Kanishtas, I'm a Kanishta, all this, whereas inside I think I'm the greatest devotee, right? All of that false humility that we sort of attempt, right? And I remember telling him that, and he said, oh, you think of yourself so qualified, do you? In Chaitanya Charitamrita, we know Srila Prabhupada, do you know who? He gives 2 examples of Kanishtadhikaris, of the associates of Mahaprabhu. He gives Tapana Mishra and Chandrasekhar. In Adi Leela, Srila Prabhupada in one purport, he writes this. He says, we can take these 2 personalities to be embodying the Kanishtadhikari because they were unable to engage in proper debate, right? And so Srila Prabhupada says this is that they cannot defend their faith, that it's shaky, right? This is the sign of the Kanishta. And so Nrsinga Kavacha Prabhu said, oh, you think of yourself on the level of Chandrasekhar and Tapana Mishra. Wow. And I thought, oh, Jai, there goes all my attempts at false humility. What to do? I'll just keep my mouth shut next time. So we hear this is the glories of the devotees. Wow. Actually, there was another example given once. Among some of Prabhupada's one of Prabhupada's godbrothers was giving an example, right? That there's certain levels of adhikar, right? Among the different processes, right? And we know deity worship is by and large given as a process to encourage Kanishtadhikaris, right? This is by and large the principle, right? Of course, that's not to say that only Kanishtadhikaris engage in deity worship, right? Srila Prabhupada engaged in deity worship, and that's all we need to know. But by and large, this is given for this. And so this godbrother, he was giving examples of his other godbrothers who were very, very good at those various processes, right, which embody the different stages. And so he said, one of his other godbrothers, right, and he said he is a very good pujari, right, and so he's giving an example, giving a glorification. But his disciples had this very tribal mood, and they started saying, Guru Maharaj, he has said that this devotee is a Kanishtadhikari, right? And they went around saying this. And eventually it came around to that godbrother. And he heard this, his disciples, they said, Gurudev, did you hear? They're saying you are Kanishtadhikari. And upon hearing this, he placed his hands up like that, and he said, wow, they've given me some adhikar then. So this is the elevated position of the devotee. Once some disciples of Srila Prabhupada, they were saying, Srila Prabhupada, we hear the Madhyamadhikari, he is engaged in preaching. We are doing book distribution. Does that mean we are all Madhyamadhikaris? They asked Srila Prabhupada like this. When Prabhupada, he said, I am preaching, you are just doing what I'm telling you to do. So we can hear, this is the principle, right? So, this is the elevated position of the devotees. And we hear there's one pastime given of one devotee, Narahari Chakravarti, right? He's sometimes also called Ghanashyam Das, and I forget which one is his birth name and which one is his initiated name. One way around it is, right? He came a bit after Mahaprabhu, right? A bit after the associates of Mahaprabhu, maybe like a few centuries. And he wrote, very famously, Bhakti Ratnakar, right? We all would have at least heard of it. Bhakti Ratnakar is interesting, but Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, to my knowledge, he published it, so he gave it his stamp of approval as a bona fide shastra. But he wasn't so big on its in-depth study. Not because it's too rasic, I think actually for the opposite principle. He said it's almost too encyclopedic. It's too much of encyclopedia. There's not enough nectar in there. It's very, very much almost like a dictionary. That was Saraswati Thakur's opinion. So more of a reference work. But he also wrote Narottama Vilas, which Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur very much enjoyed. So he's definitely a devotee. But yeah, but yeah. So very famously, he wrote that. And so in Narottam Vilas, there's a little appendix that's written by one of his disciples. And in this appendix, he recorded some of the pastimes of his spiritual master, right? So, all that to say, I'm just saying he's a bona fide personality. I'm not... Hridayananda Goswami says sometimes devotees can be omnivores, right? We're meant to be vegetarians, but we're omnivores. We take pastimes and information from everywhere and accept it all as equally valid, right? But we should be a little bit, in the same way we're discerning with our diet, we should be discerning with which pastimes, which information we're taking on board. So anyways, Narahari Chakravarti, as I said, a few centuries after the disappearance of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, right? And so, being situated in that position, he felt very, very sad, right? It's the same sort of sadness I think we all feel to some degree or another, maybe not at his level, but we feel, right, when we hear Prabhupada memories, or we read Lilamrita, or even sometimes you read like those old book distribution memories, right, of like the traveling Sankirtan party with Tamal Krishna Goswami, and you think, oh wow, I wish I was there, right? What am I doing here, right? We think, wow, if only I could have seen, Srila Prabhupada, right? All of these things, these are common thoughts. And he was feeling the same way. He was thinking, I have not seen Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. I have not seen Rupa and Sanatan Goswamis. I have not seen Jiva Goswami. All of these great associates. What to speak then of the Supreme Lord himself, Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I have not seen them, right? How unfortunate am I? What sort of sinful activities have I done that I can have this, that I can be so close to them, right, in terms of years, but I can be so far to have missed them altogether. And like this, he was at Govindaji temple, in Vrindavan. And like this, he was very, very much lamenting. He was beginning to cry and cry and cry, and he became so morose. He was rolling on the floor, right, completely upset, right? And it's described actually that he rolled all the way from Govindaji temple to Gopeshwar Mahadev. And it's a bit of a distance, right? It's a bit of a distance. But like this, he was completely upset and crying and like this. And with such a strong longing, eventually he left external consciousness, right? And in an internal consciousness, suddenly he awoke. And he saw before him, who did he see? Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. And he was thinking, Jai, right? Finally, my heart's desire I've seen. And then he sees his spiritual master, Nrsimha Chakravarti. And seeing his spiritual master, he thinks, oh wow, suddenly I'm in the association of all these wonderful individuals. And who else was there? Mahaprabhu was there. Nityananda Prabhu was there. Advaita Acharya was there. Gadadhar Pandit was there. Rupa and Sanatan were there, right? Jiva Goswami. All of them were there, right? And so he went and he paid Dandavat Pranams to his spiritual master. And his spiritual master took his hand and he presented him before Nityananda Prabhu. And he said, this is my disciple, Nityananda Prabhu. He saw him with tears coming down, right? Tears of joy now. Nityananda Prabhu took him and he said, what do I want to do with this rascal? He needs to be punished. And so he threw him at the feet of Mahaprabhu. And Mahaprabhu said, who is this rascal? And he took him and he threw him again at the feet of Nityananda Prabhu. And Nityananda Prabhu said, who is this rascal? I don't know him. And he threw him at the feet of Advaita Acharya. And Advaita Acharya said, come on guys, always throwing things in my way. And he took him and he threw him at the feet of Gadadhar Pandit. And Gadadhar Pandit said, oh, this is not fit for me. Why are you giving me this individual? And he took him and he threw him at the feet of Rupa and Sanatan, right? And then Rupa and Sanatan, they took him and they said, no, not for us. And like this, it went on and on and on, on to Jiva Goswami. From Jiva Goswami to Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, all the way down once again to a spiritual master, Nrsimha Chakravarti. And then once again now, having taken this devotee, right? His spiritual master took him and he presented him once again to Nityananda Prabhu. And Nityananda Prabhu looked at him and he said, who is this beautiful, effulgent personality who has taken the dust of the lotus feet of all of these wonderful Vaishnavas, right? Someone who has come without the dust of the lotus feet of the Vaishnavas, I'm not too interested in seeing him. But this person has collected such a wonderful collection. Surely we can accept him. And so he gave him a chamakar and he engaged him in worship. And like this, very wonderfully, Narahari Chakravarti, he was engaged in worship. And then the pastime keeps on going, and it's a relatively long one. He then has a vision of Srimati Radharani and Krishna together, and then he sees them forming Mahaprabhu and stuff like this, right? It goes on for a bit. But this point is made there, right? There, he is accepted only by Nityananda Prabhu and able to engage in worship, right? How? By taking the dust of the lotus feet of the Vaishnavas, right? And then, of course, after this, he returns into external consciousness and he starts saying, Gauranga, like this, right? And everyone in Vrindavan then, they're very happy. They're thinking, oh, what is the point of our living in Vraj if there is no Krishna Prem? But here we see somebody who has love for the devotees, right? And if he has love for the devotees, then very simply Krishna Prem is there as well, right? This is the whole point of our living in the Dham, right? That we can see people who are so dearly in love with the devotees. And so we hear this. Actually, there's one bhajan, famous one. Haven't memorized it though, so I've had to write it down. It's a Bengali one by Devaki Nandan Das Thakur, His Holiness Gaur Govinda Maharaj. He would sing it often. And begins, Vrindavan Basi Joto Vaishnaver Gon Prothome Bandana Kori Shobar Choron, right? So it begins, it's actually a whole ashtakam. Technically not an ashtakam, but it's a whole glorification, right, of the Vaishnavas, right? And it begins, he says, Prothome, right? Pratham, first. First I begin by offering my obeisances to all of the Vrindavan Vasis, right? All of the denizens of Vraj. First I offer my obeisances unto them. And there's a few siddhantas there. Obviously the primary one, as we know, those devotees in Vrindavan there, the greatest devotees, so on and so forth, right? So he starts like this, and he goes through, and he offers his respects to all of the devotees, all of the Vaishnavas, right? But then at the sixth text, there's a wonderful saying he has. Hoyachen hoibena prabhur joto das, shobar choron bandon donte korighash, right? And what he says there is, he says, I offer my respects, holding a straw between my teeth. I offer my respects to all the servants of Mahaprabhu that have been or ever will be. And so there's a point that's being made there. There's actually three different categories of individuals that are being respected there. Firstly, of course, we have all of the devotees that have been, right? So we can think all of the great acharyas, all the great devotees that have ever chanted. But we can also take it as those who have started being devotees and maybe have put a pause on their spiritual life, right? Both are in that category. And what does he say? We can only worship them, right? Somebody, they'll start chanting, they'll be chanting a few rounds every day, and then they'll think, my Devi's looking good. I'll maybe put a pause on my spiritual life. He says, even these individuals, right? Even them, let us worship them. They've taken the holy name of the Lord on their lips, right? How worshipable are they, right? And then there's also all those who will become devotees, right? And who is that? Well, hopefully that's everyone, right? So that's an unlimited amount of people. We can imagine this material world is filled with so many jivas, right? But Mahaprabhu has appeared, right? So how far and wide this Sankirtan will continue, right? So how many individuals that will include, right? Virtually, he's paying his respects to everyone. But in terms of their connection to the Vaishnavas, right? This is the value of all individuals. And what respect is he given? He's speaking about putting the straw in the teeth. Sometimes there's different descriptions given why straw in the teeth is given as a sign of humility. One that's given is sometimes you'll find in some villages in India, it's given as a punishment, right? If somebody does a really serious crime, like they kill a cow or something, like something really bad, what will happen is they'll have, with straw, shoes, different shoes will be connected, right? And they'll be connected around in sort of a mala, right? And that mala will be put on the head of the person. And they'll hold that mala in their teeth with the straw, right? There'll be a bit of straw left bare, and they'll hold onto it like that. And like that, they'll go knocking on each door in the village. And when each person sees them, they'll either, give them some nice chastisement, right? Some sort of mercy. Or they'll give them, if they're feeling nice, they'll give them some sort of dakshina, right? They'll give them some sort of rice or some sort of food or something. And like this, the individual is expected for however long, depending on how bad the crime was, they're expected to survive just on whatever they're given, right? While begging door to door like that. So that's one potential significance of the straw in the teeth, right? Another one that's given is when you have straw in the teeth, you can't make excuses, right? You can't make excuses for yourself. It's a sign of humility, right? No matter what you say, bas, I'll accept it. His Holiness Mahanidhi Maharaj, I was listening to one of his classes, and he was saying that the moment you say, yes, but, then the ahankar has come in, right? Then the ahankar is kicked in. Yes, Prabhu, I accept that, but... Actually, I remember I was speaking to one devotee. He's a relatively senior devotee in Chicago, I think. I can't remember. But he was telling me when he was a fresh devotee, right? When he was, Bhakta so-and-so, right? And he had just recently joined the Hare Krishna movement, right? And he was saying about how he had a disagreement, right? He had a real disagreement with one other devotee. And objectively speaking, he was in the right, so to speak, right? He was in the correct position, right? This other devotee had behaved improperly, right? And so he was a little bit disturbed. And so he went to a more senior devotee than him, a Prabhupada disciple, one of those devotees who started book distribution 50 years ago and hasn't stopped, right? So he went to him and he explained his issue. And hearing that, that devotee, he began to say, "Oh, so you were correct, right? You're in the right, right?" He said, this devotee hadn't said that, right? But the Prabhupada disciple, even he had inferred, right? You were in the right, right? You are correct. But you've done something very, very wrong. You've done something very, very incorrect. You've taken an opportunity to take the dust of the lotus feet of the Vaishnava and you've thrown it in the air, right? In your desire for the right thing to happen, what has happened? You've wasted this opportunity. You have this wonderful opportunity that very few of us have so regularly to go up to a devotee and very humbly say, "I have straw in my teeth. Please give me your blessings," right? Even if you're in the right, right? What value that can give. So you've done something very, very wrong. You've wasted such a valuable opportunity. And so that devotee told me, instantly he went. And he said, "Please forgive me for all my offenses." And he said, at that point, that devotee was very happy. And also apologized, right? So there was, a nice sweet ending. All of the plot threads are resolved. But that principle is there, right? How valuable it is to take the respects of the devotees, and sometimes to have the straw in the teeth, and not to give an excuse, but simply to accept the mercy. And another one that's given, I heard this last one from His Grace Madhavananda Prabhu. Madhavananda Prabhu is saying, when the mouth is closed, then only the heart can speak, right? Because the idea is, Vacho vegam, manasa krodha vegam, jiva vegam, udara pasta vegam, right? This mouth is a cause of lots of problems, right? The tongue is on fire, right? Speaking blah, blah, blah. I still remember when I first read the Upadeshamrita, often we have devotees will say, "Wow, I really relate with Prahlad Maharaj, my family are not so favorable to me getting to Krishna consciousness," right? Other devotees will say, "Wow, I really relate to Jai and Vijay, I'm such a fallen individual, and yet Srila Prabhupada has given me so much mercy, but I really relate to the frog in the purport that's speaking so much Prajalpa, it's going to get eaten by a snake." So we hear, right? This mouth is such a cause of issues, such a cause of problems, right? So Madhavananda Prabhu says, when putting the straw in the teeth, right, it's symbolizing that, right? I'm not speaking nonsense. I'm not trying not to speak anything, not just blah, blah, blah. But only sincerely what I feel in my heart. That's all that I'm trying to communicate. That's all that I'm trying to convey. So like this, we hear all of these things. And with this attitude, Devakinandan Das Thakur, what is he saying? He's saying, I offer my humble respects, my humble obeisances unto all the devotees of the Lord, right? In this wonderful way, we find the glories of the Supreme Lord. Because the Supreme Lord is not complete without his devotees. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he says this. The Supreme Lord, he comes with his paraphernalia, and if he does not come with his paraphernalia, he does not come at all, right? The Supreme Lord is not a complete incarnation without all. And then he lists this is what happens when I prepare last second. He lists the five different aspects that are given obeisances to in the invocation in Chaitanya Charitamrita. And he says, without these five, the Supreme Lord's incarnation is not complete. This is the fullness of the Supreme Lord. And so then we hear how wonderful the Lord and his associates are. We are reading here, right? Today we're hearing about the water of the Ganga, right? Ganga Devi, it's described. Where does she flow through? We hear in Mayapur, right? Whenever you go to Mayapur, you can have the wonderful darshan of Ganga Devi, right? And it's described actually that the reason why she flows in this direction, she had some influence about where her pathway was being carved. And it said intentionally she detoured into West Bengal, right? So that she could have darshan of Mahaprabhu. And so that she could have darshan of Mahaprabhu's associates. So that she would be able to also have the service, right? Of being able to wash the associates of Mahaprabhu. Of being able to engage them in some service. In the same way that we see Giriraj Govardhan, right? Govardhan is Krishna, right? In one sense, yes, right? Some of our acharyas say Govardhan is Krishna. But in a higher sense, our acharyas say, even though that is true, in a higher sense, Govardhan is the devotee of the devotees, right? And this is the greatest devotee. And because when we take to worship someone, right, we want to worship them in the greatest aspect that they have, not in the lesser aspect, right? So in this way, we worship Govardhan as a devotee, right? Because to be a devotee of the devotees is higher than being the Supreme Lord. I remember Bhakti Rasayan Sagar Maharaj, I was listening to one of his classes, and he was saying that actually Mayavadis, they lack ambition, right? They just want to become as good as the Lord. But devotees, they're the real ambitious one. They want to become greater than the Lord. So, like this we're hearing, Giriraj Govardhan, right? Why is he the greatest devotee of the devotees? It's described, right? All the grass around him is feeding all of the cows, right? All of the caves for all the gopas to play in, right? With that grass, all of the cows are being provided for. And when the cows are provided for, then all of the other, then everyone else, right? It's the center of society, the cow. All of the Vrajvasis, they're provided for as well. Anyway, so in the same way, right? Giriraj Govardhan is so nicely serving all the devotees. In the same way, Ganga Devi, she had the desire to serve all the associates of Mahaprabhu. And so she appears. And actually, this is described in Chaitanya Bhagavat. This is the reason why Pundarik Vidya Nidhi. Because Pundarik Vidya Nidhi, he actually has two homes. I forgot, the other one's somewhere else in East India, somewhere or another. But the other one he has is in Navadvip. And it's described, of course, we know internally Pundarik Vidya Nidhi comes because he is Vrishabhanu, right? And so actually Mahaprabhu sometimes he would call Pundarik Vidya Nidhi Pundarik Bap, right? Because of course Mahaprabhu, he is Krishna in the mood of Srimati Radharani. So he's referring to Pundarik Vidya Nidhi as his father, right? But Pundarik Vidya Nidhi, we know internally he is coming. For which purpose? He is coming to engage in the pastimes of Mahaprabhu. But externally in Chaitanya Bhagavat it's described, he comes actually because he's a great devotee of Ganga Devi. Actually, it's described. And this is the reason why he comes. And not only that, but it's described he never bathes in the Ganga. Which is interesting, right? Because if you're a great devotee of the Ganga, you would think you'd bathe in it, right? But it's said the reason why he did this was to protest, right? Was with his frustration that he had, because when he came to Navadvip, what did he see? People, they were washing their laundry in the Ganga, right? They were going, I'm a little bit dirty, time to clean, and they would scrub off, into the Ganga. And he was saying this is not the appropriate attitude, right? And so in order to protest that, it's described he virtually never would bathe in the Ganga, right? And this is a very special principle, because of course, Ganga Devi as well. What a great devotee she is, right? So we should always take this aspect of the value of the devotees, right? The devotees are not something cheap. They're not something simple. Again, Srila Prabhupada, when he was concluding his pastimes, some of his disciples, they said, Srila Prabhupada, as Vaishnavas, how should we perform the final rites? And Srila Prabhupada said, as Vaishnavas, we are trying to be Vaishnav. We are not yet Vaishnav. It is not such a cheap thing, right? Not such a cheap thing at all. And that's why we hear the glorifications, right? In Vrindavan, right? Everyone is a devotee. And so there's one book distributor. And at the time, he was maybe book distributing for 5 years or so, which at the time was a long time, right? During Srila Prabhupada's time. And he said, Srila Prabhupada, I've distributed so many nectar of instructions, right? Now I want to finally take that nectar of instruction. I want to move to the Dham. No more time for me, no more time for preaching, Srila Prabhupada. Let me move, right? And Srila Prabhupada said, there are already enough monkeys in Vrindavan. Don't go and be another one. So like this, we see, very elevated, all of these things are, in the full variety. So worshipable are all of the Vaishnavas, even those who are to become Vaishnavas, even those who are not yet devotees. who is Devakinandan worshipping? Who is he giving his obeisances to? Those who have taken up to Krishna consciousness and those who've paused it. How worshipable are the devotees, right? How worshipable are they? If even those who are not yet devotees but are soon to be devotees, even they are worshipable, right? With this principle we can understand the value of the Vaishnava. Therefore we can understand a tiny bit more at least. The glories of the Vaishnava are inconceivable, right? They're so great, but we can at least try to go a little deeper to try and understand the words of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, which we have read today. Okay, Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki. Nantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda ki. Yeah, we have 2 minutes, I don't know. Yeah.
So essentially I'm looking at the conversation you had in the Sri Toshan Prabhu. And so you're saying about the two disciples that you've already left who were nearby devotees. And so then as a result of that, your words were, maybe next time I should keep my mouth shut. So looking at that statement, how do we train ourselves to put ourselves in a position where we will be humiliated by the senior devotees, but then realizing that will lead to humility? So how do we facilitate that?
Well, at least in my experience, I get chastised if I'm trying or not, so I guess that would be my... I think, well, for whatever understanding I have, the devotees are merciful enough to chastise us anyways. It's described in Bhakti Siddhanta Vaibhav, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. He wouldn't be so Singhacharya with his neophyte disciples. It was with his more intimate disciples who'd been with him for longer. He would give them the heavier chastisement. You would assume that they're more advanced. So my understanding is we can pray for the mercy of the Vaishnava and hope they, let loose. Yeah.